Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into the life and crimes of serial killer Donald Leroy Evans.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I have to say, when I first saw the source material for this episode, excerpts from his Wikipedia page, I was
Hmm.
absolutely floored.
Yeah.
This guy confessed to over 70 murders
Oh, wow.
in
That
22
wow.
states.
It's
Yes,
70.
that's a lot.
It's almost too much to even comprehend.
Yeah, it's a staggering number. And you're right, it can be hard to wrap your head around that level of depravity.
Right.
But what I find most fascinating is the psychology behind it.
Yeah.
How does someone reach a point where they commit such heinous acts, seemingly without remorse? What's going on in their minds?
That's exactly what I want to try to unpack with you today.
Yep.
We're going to try to separate truth from sensationalism, understand the facts of his case, and maybe get a glimpse into the mind of Donald Leroy Evans.
I think that's a crucial approach.
These cases often become so sensationalized, but we need to remember that behind the headlines, there's a complex human story.
Hmm.
And in understanding that story, we might learn something valuable about the nature of evil itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning.
All right.
Donald Leroy Evans was born in Michigan on July 5th, 1957.
Okay.
A seemingly normal start, right? But as we'll see, things took a dark turn pretty quickly.
So his first brush with the law was in 1986 in Galveston, Texas, when he was convicted of rape
Okay.
and sentenced to 15 years in prison.
Wow.
Now, that may sound like a hefty sentence, but he only served 5 years.
Hold on, only 5 years for rape. Was that typical back then, or was there something specific about his case that led to such an early release?
That's a great question, and it's one that should be asked more often when we're looking at cases like this.
Right.
We need to understand the context of the justice system at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's possible that sentencing guidelines were different then, or perhaps there were mitigating factors in his case that led to a reduced sentence.
It makes you wonder if those 5 years were enough to truly rehabilitate him.
Right.
Did he receive any kind of therapy or counseling during his time in prison?
That's another crucial point.
Mm-hmm.
Rehabilitation is a complex process, and it's not always successful.
Right.
Without access to adequate mental health resources and support, it's much harder for individuals to address the underlying issues that led them to commit crimes in the first place.
And in Evan's case, it seems like that lack of rehabilitation might have had devastating consequences, because just a year after his release in 1991, he was back in trouble with the law.
Wow.
He returned to Galveston and even managed to get a job as a motel desk clerk.
You have to wonder about the judgment of parole officials in allowing a convicted sex offender to work in a motel.
Right.
It's a setting where he would have access to vulnerable individuals,
Yeah.
and it just seems like a recipe for disaster.
Right. It's like setting him up for failure.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing it didn't take long for things to go south.
You're right. It wasn't long before parole officials caught wind of his employment situation and had him discharged.
Oh, wow.
This led to a downward spiral for Evans, with him working odd jobs, struggling to find stability, and ultimately resorting to more violence.
So the sources say he worked on a fishing boat for a while,
Mhm.
but was soon arrested for the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl.
Oh, my goodness.
It's hard to even fathom the level of depravity involved in such an act.
Yeah.
What drives someone to harm a child in such a way?
It's a question that haunts us all.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are no easy answers.
Right.
But from a psychological perspective,
Yeah.
we can look at potential factors like severe personality disorders,
Okay.
past trauma, or distorted views of power and control.
So it's not necessarily a single cause, but a combination of factors that can lead someone down this dark path.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that we're dealing with an individual here with a unique set of experiences and circumstances. To understand Evans, we need to dig deeper into his past, his relationships, and any potential red flags that might have emerged along the way.
And it seems like his crimes didn't stop there.
Oh.
He fled to Mississippi to avoid another arrest for threats made against his ex-girlfriend.
Oh, wow.
It sounds like he was on a downward spiral, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, his crimes were about to escalate to a whole new level of horror.
Because in Gulfport, Mississippi, Evans committed the crime that would ultimately land him on death row.
Okay.
The brutal murder of 10-year-old Beatrice Louise Ruth.
This was a turning point in his case.
Hmm.
The level of violence he exhibited towards this young girl was truly shocking, even to seasoned investigators.
It's hard to even imagine the pain and terror she must have endured. What details can you share about this crime without getting too graphic?
Well, Beatrice was abducted from a park, raped and strangled to death. Her body was found in a rural area, And the medical examiner's testimony during the trial was harrowing. They described the brutality of the attack and the prolonged suffering she endured.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just a crime of opportunity.
Right.
It seems like Evans specifically targeted her.
You're right. This wasn't a random act. He had a plan, and he carried it out with chilling precision. This level of premeditation is a hallmark of many serial killers.
It's like a terrifying puzzle trying to understand the mind of someone who could do something like this. But let's try to piece it together.
Okay.
What happened after Beatrice's murder?
Evans was quickly apprehended and confessed to the kidnapping. He was sent to a federal prison in Colorado while awaiting trial in Mississippi. And it's during this time in prison that things take an even more sinister turn.
Wait, what do you mean? What happened in prison?
While incarcerated, Evans started making a series of chilling confessions. He claimed to have killed over 70 people across 22 states. He described his victims, their locations, the methods he used. It was a tidal wave of information that left investigators stunned and skeptical.
70 people?
Yeah.
That's almost impossible to believe. Does authorities think he was making it all up?
Right.
Or was there something about his confessions that rang true?
Initially, there was a lot of skepticism.
Yeah.
It sounded like the ramblings of a man desperate for attention.
Mm-hmm.
But then Evans started providing details that were too specific, too accurate to ignore.
Okay.
He described crime scenes that hadn't been released to the public victims who fit unsolved cases and patterns in his killings that pointed to a disturbing level of organization and premeditation.
Okay, so we've got this guy who's already convicted of a rape and murder, now claiming to have killed dozens more.
Right.
And some of what he's saying is checking out.
Yeah.
What did authorities do with this information? Did they launch a full-scale investigation into his claims?
They did, but it was a massive undertaking. Evans's alleged crimes spanned multiple states, involved victims from all walks of life, and stretched back over several years.
Right.
It was a logistical nightmare trying to corroborate his claims.
I bet.
But what they discovered would send shockwaves through the criminal justice system.
This is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned earlier that some of his confessions were corroborated.
Right.
What did they find?
Well, two of Evans's descriptions perfectly matched unsolved cases in Florida.
Wow.
The details he provided, the locations, the methods, it was all too specific to be a coincidence.
Right?
And this realization opened up a Pandora's box of questions and fears.
So it wasn't just the ramblings of a madman. He was telling the truth, at least, about some of his crimes.
Yeah.
What happened next? Did they charge him with these Florida murders?
They did, but it wasn't a straightforward process. Remember, Evans was already on death row in Mississippi for the murder of Beatrice Louise Ruth. So there were legal hurdles to overcome in order to try him for crimes committed in another state.
It sounds like a jurisdictional nightmare. Did they eventually manage to extradite him to Florida?
Not exactly. Instead of going through a lengthy and complicated extradition process, authorities in Florida decided to offer Evans a plea deal.
A plea deal? For a serial killer, that seems risky. What were the terms of this deal?
In exchange for a guilty plea to the 1985 strangulation murder of a woman named Ira Jean Smith in Florida, Evans would receive a life sentence to be served concurrently with his Mississippi death sentence.
Hold on. Ira Jean Smith. Was that one of the unsolved cases he confessed to?
Yes.
Okay.
Ira Jean Smith was one of the cases he described in detail.
And why agree to a plea deal when he was already facing the death penalty?
It's hard to say for sure.
Right.
Maybe he wanted to avoid another trial, or perhaps he felt some sense of remorse for that particular crime.
Right.
Or maybe it was a way to exert some control over the situation, a final act of defiance.
It's chilling to think about the calculated nature of his actions.
Yeah.
Even facing the ultimate punishment, he was still trying to manipulate the system.
That's what makes these cases so fascinating and disturbing. We're trying to understand the mind of someone who operates outside the boundaries of normal human behavior.
So at this point, Evans is on death row in Mississippi with an additional life sentence in Florida for the murder of Ira Jean Smith.
Correct.
But the story doesn't end there, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Because there's another name that surfaces in connection with Evans, Janet Malvich.
Janet Malvich. Who was she and how does she fit into all of this?
Details about Janet Malvich are limited, but her case remains unsolved, and there are suspicions that Evans may have been involved in her disappearance.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, and with each layer we uncover more darkness, more potential victims.
Exactly. And this is what makes Evans's case so complex and disturbing.
Yeah.
It's not just about the crimes we know he committed.
Right.
It's about the possibility that there are many more victims out there, families still searching for answers, haunted by the unknown.
It's heartbreaking to think about the ripple effect of his actions, the pain he inflicted on so many lives. And speaking of pain, Evans's story doesn't end with a quiet death on death row, does it?
No, it doesn't. In a strange twist of fate, he manages to escape from the Harrison County Jail in Mississippi in June of 1993.
Wait, he escaped? How on earth did he manage to pull that off?
The details of his escape are a bit murky,
Okay.
but it involves some clever planning and a good dose of luck.
Mm-hmm.
He managed to overpower a guard, get access to keys, and slip out unnoticed.
Wow.
It was a brazen move that sent shockwaves through the community.
I can only imagine the fear and panic that must have gripped people when they realized a convicted serial killer was on the loose.
Absolutely. It was a massive manhunt with law enforcement agencies from multiple states working around the clock to track him down.
So how long was he on the run? And how did they finally catch him?
Thankfully, his freedom was short-lived. He was recaptured just a few days later, hiding in a shed not far from the jail.
Oh, wow.
It was a huge relief for everyone involved.
I bet. But even though his escape attempt failed, he couldn't escape his ultimate fate, could he?
No, he couldn't. On January 5th, 1999, Donald Leroy Evans was stabbed to death by a fellow death row inmate, Jimmy Mack, at the Mississippi State Penitentiary.
Wow. Killed on death row by another inmate? That's intense. Who was this Jimmy Mack and what led to this violent confrontation?
Jimmy Mack was no stranger to violence himself.
Okay.
He was on death row for the 1990 murder of Henry Fulton in Bolivar County, Mississippi.
Okay.
The details of the altercation between Mack and Evans are unclear, but it resulted in Mack being convicted of manslaughter and receiving an additional 20 years on his sentence. Interestingly, his original death sentence was later commuted to life in prison.
It's a tragic and ironic end to Evan's story. Killed by another inmate in the very place where he was supposed to be serving out his final days.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the nature of violence, how it seems to permeate even the most secure environments.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions about the effectiveness of our prison system, the psychological impact of long-term incarceration, and the cycle of violence that seems to plague our society.
This has been quite a deep dive so far, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this complex and disturbing case.
You're right. There's so much more to unpack here.
Yeah.
We've explored the chronology of Evans's crimes, but we haven't delved into the deeper psychological and societal factors that might have contributed to his descent into darkness.
Exactly. What can we learn from cases like this? How do we prevent future tragedies? And how do we support the victims and families who are left to pick up the pieces? Let's take a quick break to gather our thoughts, and when we come back, we'll dive deeper into the implications of Donald Leroy Evans's life and crimes. Okay, so we've laid out the facts of Donald Leroy Evans's case. A chilling timeline of escalating violence culminating in his death on death row. But now I think it's time to shift gears and really dig into the why. What can we learn from a case like this?
You've hit the nail on the head. Understanding the why is crucial, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's easy to simply label Evans as a monster and move on. But I think we owe it to ourselves and to potential future victims to try to understand the factors that might contribute to someone becoming a serial killer.
I completely agree. So where do we even begin? Is it nature or nurture? Was Evans simply born evil, or did something happen in his life, his childhood maybe, that set him on this path?
That's the age-old question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's rarely a simple answer. It's usually a complex interplay of both nature and nurture. We can look at Evans's early life, his first conviction for rape, his time in prison. Were there any red flags, any missed opportunities for intervention?
Well, you mentioned earlier that he only served 5 years of a 15-year sentence for that first rape conviction. Did that early release play a role in his subsequent crimes? Could more have been done to rehabilitate him during his time in prison?
It's impossible to say for sure, but it's certainly a question worth pondering.
Yeah.
5 years may not be sufficient time to address the deep-seated psychological issues that might contribute to sexual violence.
So are you suggesting that the penal system might be partly to blame here? That perhaps a longer sentence with more emphasis on therapy and rehabilitation could have prevented some of these later tragedies?
I think it's fair to say that the criminal justice system, particularly back then, wasn't always equipped to handle the complexities of rehabilitation.
Right.
We've come a long way in our understanding of criminal psychology and the importance of addressing underlying trauma and mental health issues. But there's always room for improvement.
It's a sobering thought, realizing that some of these crimes might have been preventable.
Yeah.
That perhaps with the right interventions, Evans could have been steered away from this path of destruction.
It's a difficult truth to grapple with, but it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to criminal justice. Punishment alone is not always enough.
Mhm.
We need to focus on rehabilitation, on addressing the root causes of criminal behavior, and on creating a system that supports both victims and offenders.
And speaking of victims, it's important to remember that Evans's actions had a devastating impact on countless individuals and families. Beatrice, Louise Ruth, Ira, Jean Smith, Janet Movich, and potentially dozens more. Their stories deserve to be heard, their pain acknowledged.
Absolutely. We can't forget the human cost of these crimes,
Right.
the ripple effect of trauma that extends far beyond the immediate victims. Families, shattered communities, terrorized, a sense of safety and trust eroded.
It's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism of a case like this, but we need to remember that behind the headlines, there are real people who have suffered unimaginable loss.
Yeah.
What kind of support do they need to cope with such trauma?
Well, first and foremost, they need to feel heard and validated.
Okay.
They need to know that their pain is real, their loss is acknowledged, and their stories matter. They need access to therapy, counseling, support groups, and any other resources that can help them navigate the long and difficult road to healing.
And it's not just about providing immediate support. The trauma of losing a loved one to violence can have long-term effects. It can impact relationships, mental health, and even future generations.
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to recognize that the healing process is ongoing. There's no timeline, no quick fix. It's about providing ongoing support, creating a safe space for victims and families to share their stories, and empowering them to rebuild their lives.
So we've talked about the need for better rehabilitation programs within the prison system and the importance of providing comprehensive support for victims and families. But is there anything we can do to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Uh,
And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. There's no magic formula to prevent someone from becoming a serial killer. But I do think there are things we can do as a society to mitigate the risk.
like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for starters, we can focus on early intervention, identifying children and adolescents who might be exhibiting concerning behaviors such as cruelty to animals, fascination with violence, or social isolation. These aren't necessarily predictors of future violence,
Right.
but they can be red flags that warrant further assessment and support.
So it's about being more aware of the warning signs and creating a culture where people feel comfortable coming forward with concerns.
Exactly. We need to break down the stigma surrounding mental health and encourage open communication about these issues.
I think you've made a really important point. We tend to focus on the aftermath of these tragedies, but we need to be more proactive in addressing the factors that might contribute to them.
I couldn't agree more. It's a complex issue with no easy solutions, but it's a conversation we need to be having.
Hmm.
And it's not just the responsibility of law enforcement or mental health professionals. It's a collective responsibility.
Yeah.
Parents, teachers, community leaders, we all have a role to play in creating a safer society.
It's about fostering empathy, understanding, and a willingness to intervene when we see something that's not right. It's about creating a culture where violence is not tolerated and where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
Well said. It's about shifting our perspective from punishment to prevention, from isolation to integration, from fear to understanding. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that the well-being of our communities depends on the well-being of each individual.
You've given us a lot to think about, so let's bring it back to Donald Leroy Evans. His story is a tragic one filled with darkness and violence. But what can we learn from his life and crimes? How can we use this knowledge to prevent future tragedies?
Evans's case highlights the importance of taking a holistic approach to criminal justice. It's not just about locking people up and throwing away the key. It's about understanding the underlying causes of criminal behavior, providing opportunities for rehabilitation, and creating a system that supports both victims and offenders.
It's about recognizing that every individual has a story, a complex web of experiences and circumstances that shape who they are. And it's about believing that even in the darkest of hearts, there's a flicker of humanity that can be reached.
That's a powerful message and one that I think is crucial to remember. It's easy to demonize individuals like Evans, to see them as monsters beyond redemption. But I believe that by understanding their stories, by delving into the complexities of their lives, we can gain valuable insights that can help us prevent future tragedies.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of the same human family and that we have a shared responsibility to create a world where violence is not the answer.
Well said. It's about fostering empathy, compassion, and a belief in the possibility of change. It's about breaking down barriers, building bridges, and working together to create a safer and more just society for all.
It's interesting that even in Evans's final moments, violence was present. Killed by another inmate on death row. What does that tell us about the cycle of violence? Is it something that can truly be broken?
That's a profound question, and one that I don't think has a simple answer. Violence is a complex phenomenon with deep roots in our history, our culture, and even our biology. It's a force that can be both destructive and creative, both terrifying and alluring.
It's almost like a paradox. We're both repulsed and fascinated by violence. We condemn it, yet we're drawn to it in movies, books, and even video games.
You've hit on a key point. We live in a society that's saturated with violence, both real and imagined. And I think this constant exposure desensitizes us to its true cost, its ability to inflict pain and suffering.
So how do we break this cycle? How do we create a culture where violence is not the norm?
It's a daunting task, but I believe it's possible. It starts with awareness, with recognizing the pervasiveness of violence in our society and its harmful effects. It's about having open and honest conversations about these issues, about challenging the narratives that glorify violence and promoting alternatives that emphasize empathy, compassion, and peaceful conflict resolution.
It's about teaching our children to value kindness and respect, to resolve differences peacefully, and to seek help when they're struggling. It's about creating a world where violence is not seen as a solution, but as a problem that we can work together to overcome.
Well said. It's a long and difficult journey, but it's one worth taking. And I believe that by working together, by fostering a culture of empathy and understanding, we can create a world where violence is no longer the answer.
And what about Donald Leroy Evans? His story is a dark one, but can we find any glimmer of hope in it?
I think even in the darkest of stories, there's always something to be learned. Evans's case highlights the need for compassion, not just for the victims, but for the perpetrators as well. It reminds us that every individual, no matter how far they've strayed from the path, is worthy of our empathy and understanding.
It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, even those who have committed horrific acts. And it's about believing that even in the darkest of hearts, there's a spark of light that can be kindled.
Exactly. It's about seeing beyond the labels, the judgments, the stereotypes. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and that the choices we make, the actions we take, have a ripple effect on the world around us.
It's a powerful message of hope and possibility, even in the face of unimaginable darkness. And it's a reminder that the fight against violence is not just about law enforcement or punishment. It's a fight that must be waged in our hearts, in our minds, and in our communities.
It's a fight for a world where every individual is valued, where every life is cherished, and where violence is no longer the answer.
Let's take a moment to absorb all that we've learned about Donald Leroy Evans, and then come back to talk about what his story means for us and our understanding of serial killers, the justice system, and the search for hope in a world that can often feel very dark. We spent a lot of time unpacking the life and crimes of Donald Leroy Evans, a man who confessed to over 70 murders across 22 states.
That's a lot.
It's been heavy, to say the least.
Yeah.
But I think what stuck with me the most isn't the sheer number of his alleged victims, but the question of why. What makes someone capable of such monstrous acts?
It's a question that has haunted criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists for centuries. And while we may never have a definitive answer, I think exploring cases like Evans's can offer some valuable insights.
So let's talk about those insights. What are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should walk away with today?
Well, first and foremost, I think Evans's case highlights the complexity of human behavior.
Okay.
There's rarely a single factor that can explain why someone becomes a serial killer. It's usually a combination of genetic predispositions, environmental influences, and personal choices.
It's that nature versus nurture debate again, isn't it? How much of who we are is predetermined and how much is shaped by our experiences.
Exactly. And in Evans' case, we see evidence of both.
Okay.
We know he had a troubled childhood marked by abuse and neglect. We know he had that early conviction for rape, suggesting a pattern of violence and disregard for others. But we also see evidence of premeditation in his crimes, a chilling level of calculation that suggests something more than just a reaction to his environment.
So it's not a simple equation. It's a tangled web of factors that interact in ways we may never fully understand.
Right.
But doesn't that make it even more important to try?
Absolutely.
To keep searching for answers, to keep learning from these cases, even though they're so difficult to comprehend.
I absolutely agree. The search for understanding is crucial, even when it's painful, even when it leads us into dark corners of the human psyche, because in that search, we might find ways to prevent future tragedies, to identify warning signs, and to intervene before it's too late.
You mentioned earlier the importance of early intervention, of recognizing potential red flags in childhood and adolescence. Can you elaborate on that a bit? What are some of those red flags that parents, teachers, or even friends should be aware of?
One of the most consistent red flags is cruelty to animals.
Okay.
It's not just about kids pulling the wings off flies.
Yeah.
It's about a pattern of deliberate and callous infliction of pain on living creatures.
So if a child is repeatedly hurting animals, it's a sign that something deeper might be going on.
Exactly. It could be a sign of a lack of empathy, a distorted view of power and control, or even underlying psychological issues. Of course, not every child who hurts an animal will grow up to be a serial killer,
Right.
but it's a warning sign that shouldn't be ignored.
What are some other red flags?
Another red flag is a fascination with violence, especially preoccupation with death, gore, and serial killers.
Oh,
Now, it's perfectly normal for kids to be curious about these things, especially in today's media-saturated world.
right.
But if you notice a child who is fixated on violence, who seems to derive pleasure from it, or who is constantly seeking out disturbing content, it, it might be a cause for concern.
So it's about paying attention to the intensity and duration of their interest, right? If it goes beyond just a passing curiosity, it might be a sign that something's not quite right. What else?
Social isolation is another big one.
Okay.
We're social creatures by nature. We need connection, belonging, and intimacy. If a child is consistently withdrawing from others, if they have difficulty forming relationships, or if they seem to lack empathy for others, it could be a sign that they're struggling emotionally.
And those struggles, if left unaddressed, could potentially manifest in harmful ways.
Exactly. Now, I want to be clear that these red flags are not destiny. They're simply indicators that further assessment and support might be needed. It's about recognizing the warning signs and intervening early before those behaviors escalate into something more serious.
It's about creating a safety net, a system of support that catches those who are falling through the cracks. And it's about fostering a culture of empathy where people feel comfortable seeking help for themselves or others.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about creating a community where everyone feels valued, where everyone has a sense of belonging, and where violence is not seen as an acceptable solution to problems.
So what does this all mean for our listener? What's the takeaway message here?
I think the takeaway message is that we all have a role to play in preventing violence.
Okay.
It's not just the responsibility of law enforcement or mental health professionals. It's a collective responsibility.
If you see something, say something, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you notice a child or adolescent who is exhibiting concerning behaviors, don't be afraid to speak up. Talk to their parents, a teacher, a counselor, or another trusted adult. It could make all the difference.
And what about for those of us who are fascinated by true crime, by cases like Donald Leroy Evans's? Is there a way to engage with this content responsibly?
I think it's important to approach true crime with a critical eye, to remember that behind the headlines, there are real people whose lives have been impacted by these events. It's about seeking understanding, not just entertainment.
It's about recognizing the humanity in both the victims and the perpetrators and acknowledging the complex web of factors that contribute to these tragedies.
Well said. It's about learning from the past so that we can create a better future.
I think that's a powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the life and crimes of Donald Leroy Evans. It's been a heavy topic, but I hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
I hope so.
And I hope it's inspired you to think critically about these issues and to engage in conversations that can lead to positive change.
And I hope it's inspired you to think critically about these issues and to engage in conversations that can lead to positive change.
Because ultimately, the fight against violence is a fight we must wage together.
And it's a fight we can win.
Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a better place.